The courtroom felt like a battlefield that morning, though Judge Harrison couldn't have known he was about to face his own judgment day. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 73-year-old Walter Brooks slowly made his way to the defendant's table, his weathered hands gripping his walker with the same determination that once held an M16 in the jungles of Vietnam. His back was bent now, not from age alone, but from wounds that had never fully healed. Wounds earned in service to a country whose representative now sat ready to mock him. Judge Harrison looked down at the case file with barely concealed contempt. Another parking violation. Another veteran claiming special circumstances. He'd seen this act before, or so he thought. The way these old-timers played up their service for sympathy made his blood boil. His own father had served and never asked for special treatment, never complained, never made excuses. The charge was simple enough. Walter had parked in a handicapped space outside the VA hospital without displaying the proper permit. The permit that had fallen behind his dashboard during his rush to make his appointment. The appointment for the cancer treatment that was slowly eating away at what remained of his body after the war had taken its toll. "Mr. Brooks," Judge Harrison began, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that made the court reporter shift uncomfortably in her seat. "I see here you're claiming you couldn't find your handicapped permit. How convenient." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Walter's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, a soldier's discipline keeping his anger in check. "Your Honor," Walter's court-appointed attorney stood, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who'd taken the case pro bono. "My client has documented disabilities from his service in Vietnam. His Purple Heart citation clearly states—" "Purple Heart?" Judge Harrison interrupted, leaning back in his chair with theatrical skepticism. "Let me guess. Another war hero? Another brave soldier who somehow can't follow simple parking regulations?" The gallery stirred uneasily. Several people exchanged glances. This wasn't normal judicial behavior. Walter's hands trembled slightly on his walker, but not from fear, from rage. The same rage he'd felt when politicians had called them baby killers when they came home. The same rage he'd swallowed for 50 years while his friends died from Agent Orange exposure and the VA denied their claims. "Your Honor," Sarah tried again, "Mr. Brooks has mobility issues directly related to shrapnel wounds sustained during the Tet Offensive. He was stationed at Firebase Alpha when—" "Firebase Alpha?" The judge's eyebrows rose mockingly. "How dramatic. Tell me, Mr. Brooks, do all veterans have such colorful stories? Or do you practice them for moments like this?" The court reporter's fingers froze over her keys. She'd been transcribing trials for 15 years and had never heard a judge speak this way. That's when Walter spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly but strong. "I don't practice anything, Your Honor. I live with it every day, every morning when I can't stand straight, every night when the metal in my spine reminds me where I've been." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Metal in your spine? How theatrical. You know what I think, Mr. Brooks? I think you're a faker. I think you're playing up some minor service record for sympathy. I've seen your type before. You probably spent your tour behind a desk, and now you want special treatment." The word faker echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Sarah Chen's face went pale. The bailiff, a young man named Tommy Martinez, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Walter's eyes, those pale blue eyes that had seen friends die and enemies fall, that had watched villages burn and children cry, locked onto the judge's face. For a moment, just a moment, Judge Harrison saw something that made him lean back slightly. It wasn't anger. It was pity. "Your Honor," Walter said slowly, each word measured, "I've been called many things in my life, but never a faker. Not about this." He shifted his weight on the walker, and the soft grunt of pain that escaped wasn't performance. It was real, visceral, the kind of sound that made everyone in the room wince. Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Mr. Brooks, your alleged service record isn't relevant here. What's relevant is that you broke the law. And frankly, I'm tired of veterans thinking their service is a get-out-of-jail-free card. You're no different than any other citizen in my courtroom." That's when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Not dramatically, not with a bang, but with the quiet precision of military training. 3 men entered, their presence immediately commanding attention despite their civilian clothes. They moved with the synchronized gait of soldiers, even decades after their service had ended. The first was Marcus Thompson, 6'4", and built like he could still carry a wounded comrade through enemy fire, though his hair was silver now. The second, Luis Rodriguez, walked with a slight limp, but held himself with the bearing of a sergeant major. The third, James Doc Wilson, smaller than the others, but with hands that had saved more lives than he could count, including Walter's. They weren't supposed to be there. They'd been sitting in their monthly Vietnam Veterans coffee meeting at the diner across from the courthouse when Tommy Martinez had sent a text to his uncle Luis during a recess. The message was simple. Judge calling a Purple Heart recipient a faker. It's Walter Brooks. Luis had shown the message to the others. They hadn't discussed it. They hadn't debated. They'd simply stood up, left money on the table, and walked across the street. Because that's what you do. You don't leave a man behind. Not in the jungle, not in a courthouse, not ever. Judge Harrison noticed them immediately. Gentlemen, this is a closed proceeding. Unless you have business before the court. We do, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded men under fire. We're here for Walter. The judge's face reddened. This is highly irregular. Bailiff. But Tommy Martinez didn't move. He recognized the look in these men's eyes. He'd seen it in Afghanistan, in the faces of soldiers who'd reached their limit. These weren't troublemakers. These were warriors who'd heard one of their own dishonored. Your Honor, Luis Rodriguez spoke, pulling out a weathered piece of paper from his jacket. I was Walter's squad leader at Firebase Alpha. I was there the night he earned his Purple Heart. The night he dragged 2 wounded men to safety while taking shrapnel in his back and legs. The night he refused morphine so Doc here could save it for the critical cases. Doc Wilson stepped forward. I was the medic who pulled 14 pieces of shrapnel out of this man's body. Pieces we couldn't get all out. Pieces that are still there, showing up on every x-ray, causing him pain every single day. Judge Harrison's confidence began to crack. Gentlemen, I don't care about your war stories. This is about a parking violation. No, Marcus interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. This is about you calling a decorated veteran a faker. This is about disrespecting a man who gave more for this country than you could ever understand. Sarah Chen saw her opportunity. Your Honor, if I may introduce these witnesses into evidence. They're not scheduled witnesses, the judge snapped, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. They don't need to be scheduled, a new voice said from the gallery. Everyone turned to see an elderly woman stand up. Margaret Harrison, the judge's own mother. She'd been sitting in the back, having come to watch her son preside over what she thought would be routine cases. They're character witnesses. And son, you need to hear them. The judge's face went from red to white. Mother, this is shameful, she finished for him. Your grandfather earned a Bronze Star in World War II. Your uncle died in Korea. And you're sitting there calling this man a faker? Her voice broke slightly. I didn't raise you to be this man. The courtroom was silent except for the humming of the fluorescent lights and the soft wheeze of Walter's breathing. Sarah Chen remained standing, feeling like she was watching history unfold. The court reporter had stopped typing entirely, her hands frozen over the keys. Marcus Thompson reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Your Honor, this is Walter's complete service record. Officially declassified last year. 2 Purple Hearts, not 1. Bronze Star with V for Valor. Army Commendation Medal. Vietnam Service Medal with 4 campaign stars. He walked forward and placed it on the judge's bench. Page 14 details the injuries. Page 22 has the x-rays from last month, showing the metal fragments still lodged near his spine. Judge Harrison opened the folder with trembling hands. As he read, his face changed. The photographs from 1969 showed a young Walter Brooks, barely recognizable now, being loaded onto a medical evacuation helicopter, his uniform soaked with blood. Another showed him receiving his Purple Heart from a general whose name the judge recognized from history books. But it was the last document that broke him. A letter from Walter's commanding officer, written in 1970, recommending him for the Medal of Honor, and recommendation that had been downgraded to a Bronze Star due to the politics of an unpopular war. The letter described how Specialist Brooks had held a defensive position alone for 47 minutes, while his squad evacuated wounded, how he'd been hit multiple times but continued firing until reinforcements arrived. Judge Harrison's voice failed him. He cleared his throat and tried again. You didn't know, Walter said quietly, speaking directly to the judge for the first time since his defenders had arrived. That's the problem, Your Honor. You assumed. You assumed I was lying. You assumed I was exaggerating. You assumed I was less than I am. Luis Rodriguez stepped forward. Walter never talks about his service. Never. We've known each other 50 years, meet every month, and he's never once brought up what he did. You know why? Because real heroes don't need to. They carry it in their bones, in their scars, in their nightmares. Doc Wilson added, the only reason he even mentioned his Purple Heart today was because his lawyer brought it up. Walter would have paid the fine and walked away. That's who he is. But we won't let you dishonor him. Not in front of us. Not ever. The bailiff, Tommy Martinez, finally spoke. Your Honor, I request permission to speak. Judge Harrison, looking defeated, nodded weakly. I've been your bailiff for 3 years, Tommy said. I've watched you preside over hundreds of cases. You're usually fair, usually just. But today, you dishonored not just Mr. Brooks, but every veteran who's ever stood in this courtroom. My Uncle Luis saved my life by talking me through PTSD when I came home. These men like Mr. Brooks, they're the reason people like me could serve. They paved the road with their blood. Margaret Harrison stood up again. Richard, she said, using her son's first name, your father would be ashamed. He taught you better than this. These men fought so you could sit on that bench. The least you can do is treat them with dignity. Judge Harrison's hands shook as he closed the folder. The courtroom waited. Walter stood as straight as his damaged spine would allow, still gripping his walker, still maintaining the dignity that no injury could take from him. Mr. Brooks, the judge began, his voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, cleared his throat, and started again, louder this time. Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology. Not as a judge, but as a citizen of the country you served. As a man who has lived his entire life in the freedom you helped preserve. He stood up, something judges rarely did during proceedings. I let my personal biases cloud my judgment. I let cynicism replace compassion. I assumed the worst instead of honoring the best. He paused, visibly struggling. The case against you is dismissed. But more than that, I want to personally apologize for my words, my attitude, and my disrespect. Walter nodded slowly. Apology accepted, Your Honor. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. No, that's not enough. Mr. Brooks, gentlemen, he addressed all the veterans. I want to do more than apologize. I want to learn. Would you be willing to meet with me? To help me understand? To help me be better? Marcus Thompson looked at the others, some silent communication passing between them. We meet every Tuesday at Murphy's Diner, 7 in the morning. Coffee's terrible, stories are better. I'll be there, the judge said. As the veterans turned to leave, Walter stopped. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, placing it on the defendant's table. It was his handicapped parking permit, wrinkled and worn. It was in my pocket the whole time, he said. I found it during the recess. But I wanted to see this through. Not for me. For them. He gestured to the gallery, where several other elderly veterans had been watching. For every veteran who's been called a faker, who's been doubted, who's been dishonored, Judge Harrison picked up the permit with trembling hands. You could have shown this and ended everything. Yes, Walter agreed. But then you wouldn't have learned anything, and neither would anyone else here. As Walter slowly made his way out of the courtroom, supported by his brothers in arms, every person in the gallery stood. The court reporter stood. The bailiff stood. Even Margaret Harrison stood, tears streaming down her face. They didn't clap. That would have been inappropriate. But they stood in silent respect for a man who'd stood for them 50 years ago in a jungle halfway around the world. Judge Harrison remained standing long after the courtroom emptied. The folder still lay open on his bench, the photographs of a young warrior staring up at him, accusing him with eyes that looked exactly like the old man who'd just forgiven him. The next Tuesday, he showed up at Murphy's Diner at 7 in the morning. The coffee was indeed terrible, but he drank every drop as he listened to stories that textbooks never told. Stories of 19-year-old boys becoming men in the worst possible circumstances. Stories of courage that didn't look like movies, that looked like terror overcome by duty. Stories of coming home to a country that didn't understand, that didn't want to understand. Walter was there, sitting in the same booth he'd occupied for 20 years. When the judge entered, Walter simply nodded and gestured to an empty chair. No more needed to be said about what had happened in the courtroom. That was past. This was about moving forward. Over the following months, Judge Harrison became a regular at the Tuesday morning meetings. He learned about Agent Orange and its lasting effects. He learned about PTSD before it had a name. He learned about the VA's failures and successes. But mostly, he learned about honor, real honor, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but lives quietly in damaged bodies and determined spirits. A year later, when another veteran stood in his courtroom, Judge Harrison saw him differently, saw the possible stories, the probable pain, the certain sacrifice. He treated every defendant with dignity, but veterans with an extra measure of understanding. Not favoritism, but recognition. Not special treatment, but earned respect. Walter Brooks continued to attend the Tuesday meetings until his cancer finally won its battle 3 years later. At his funeral, Judge Harrison was a pallbearer, one of 6 men who carried a hero to his final rest. As they lowered the casket, draped in the flag Walter had served, the judge whispered the words he should have said that first day. "Thank you for your service." But Walter had already known from the moment the judge stood up in his courtroom, had known from the first Tuesday morning at Murphy's, had known from every case where the judge remembered that behind every defendant might be a story of sacrifice. That's the thing about real heroes. They don't need parades or speeches or special recognition. They just need to not be called fakers. They need to be believed. They need to be seen for who they really are. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their country called. The walker Walter used that day in court now sits in a display case in the courthouse, donated by his widow. Beside it, a plaque reads, "In memory of Walter Brooks and all who serve in silence. May we never forget their valor. May we never doubt their sacrifice." Judge Harrison reads that plaque every morning when he enters the courthouse. It reminds him that justice isn't just about law, it's about understanding, it's about humility, it's about recognizing that sometimes the greatest courage comes in the form of an old man with a walker, standing up to ignorance with dignity. And in Murphy's Diner, every Tuesday at 7 in the morning, Walter's chair remains empty, but not forgotten. Sometimes a young veteran, fresh from Afghanistan or Iraq, will sit there, welcomed by the older men who understand that wars change, but warriors remain the same. They'll tell their stories, share their pain, and find what Walter helped create. A place where no one is called a faker, where everyone is believed, where valor, even silent valor, is always recognized. The coffee is still terrible, but nobody comes for the coffee.